into the general ideas of what's going on. Let me get this up real quick so that it works from the screen. So the first thing that I want us to point out is the definition itself of sociology. So what is sociology? Basic idea, it's the study of human social behavior from a group perspective. So again, it's the idea of the larger. It's not the individual. It is not my behavior because of the factors that have influenced me. It's how the group's behavior reacts, how the group shapes my behavior, not my own individual influences. What we did yesterday. So really quickly, like kind of refresh, we have, I know at least one person who was not here with us yesterday. What did we do yesterday that was a social interaction? What? You can't, yeah, okay, good. Coming to school itself is a social interaction. Specifically in this class though, what did we do? We played the game where we went and we tried to get everybody across using things. And the social interaction was how people related to each other and influenced each other's behavior. You influenced because one of you had an idea, you communicated that idea to the rest of the group, and then you tried to get people to agree with it. For some people, it was really easy. Some of the other classes, there was some more back and forth. It was, hey, I don't like that idea, or one class, this guy kept talking about an idea and they completely ignored him, and then went on and did something else. So there's different ways for you to interact, and that shows up in different ways. So Cade said coming to school is social interaction. What are some everyday social interactions that you engage in?
Home life.
Oh, your home life. So how you interact with your parents. Now, does everybody interact with their family in the same way? No. Some families are, okay, well, here's a great example. How many of your families sit down every night and have dinner together at the dinner table? Okay. How many of your families you eat at different times because of the schedules that your family have? Okay. How many of you maybe eat together but it's in front of the TV? A couple people. So right here we've got 3 or 4 different ways that people interact with their family. So social interactions, even in similar units of society like the family or a classroom, they don't always react the same way. They don't always do the same things. Okay. Class is another example. Not every class is the same way. How many of you have a class that is straight lecture all the time? How many of you have classes that are more projects where you do a lot of activities in there? How many of you are in classes where there's rows and rows of desks? How many of you are in classes where, well, I'm not going to ask about this because everybody's got this class. So, but there's different types of classes. There's different ways of doing it. Those interactions are different. Now, a social phenomenon is observable facts or events that involve human society. Now, when you hear the term phenomenon, what do you think? What does that make you think of?
Something big.
Okay, something big. What else?
Unnatural.
Oh, good. Unnatural. A lot of people, that's what I think of is a phenomenon is unnatural. What else? How else would you describe phenomenon? So put it this way, is it a phenomenon to observe College Station High School cafeteria lunch? Let's look at the definition though.
Yes.
Observable facts or events that involve human society. Does that definition apply? Yeah. So we don't need to get hung up on the term phenomenon being special or unique or supernatural or unnatural. Okay? A phenomenon is anything we can observe that's happening in front of us. So lunch is a phenomenon. The fact that we sit down together, the fact that we sit down and we eat at tables is a phenomenon that we can observe. Everyday, ordinary thing is normal. But in sociology, we don't just focus on the mundane, natural everything. Okay? Anybody ever seen a flash mob? Anybody ever been in a flash mob? Anybody know what a flash mob is? Okay, good. Okay. Yay. All right, so 2 years ago, I believe, the senior class of 2015, they did a flash mob in the Commons. Okay, they broke down, I think it was it High School Musical, I think? So they did the High School Musical thing. That's a flash mob. That is an example of a social phenomenon of people basically just doing something unique and different. So you can observe that. What would be another example of something that we see or we could observe? It could be a mundane thing or something that out of the ordinary.
Sporting events.
Absolutely. Sporting events are an excellent example of a social phenomenon. Do people at Dallas Cowboy games behave the same way as people at Green Bay Packer games? No, they're different. They're very unique. Do people in a football game behave the same way as people in a basketball game? What about baseball? Very different. So we can observe these behaviors and we can connect to why. Why do you think people in football games behave one way and people in baseball games behave another? What are some factors that can have that happen?
Tempo.
What?
Pace and tempo of the.
Yes. Pace and tempo. Football tends to move a little bit faster than baseball. Baseball is a much more slow game for the most part. It's paced out differently. Okay. What else? What's another factor? Yeah.
Like the size of the crowd.
Right. Okay. If you've ever been to, here's an example. When I was in college at A&M basketball didn't get a lot of attention. We weren't very good for a long time. But then when we started having some success, especially when our women's team was getting close and did actually eventually win the national championship a few years ago, the crowds got bigger and it changed. Now we've got, if you go to an A&M basketball game, you've got the, is it Hullabaloo? They've got a band that plays. They've got a lot more interaction. There's a lot more things going on. I went to a game this past Christmas, and there's a giant, inflatable balloon that flies around and, drops T-shirts out. That wasn't there when I was there. The only way they got us there was, hey, you can go on the court and have a chance to shoot a basket and win, free books for a year or something. So, it was a great way to go, but they've changed because the crowds have gotten bigger. Now, did we add more stuff because the crowds got bigger, or did we add more stuff to get bigger crowds? Or is it both? It's a little bit of both, yeah. Okay, so some other examples. We'll kind of show you some of those later on. Here's a flash mob. I'm going to show you, probably not today, I may show it to you tomorrow. I'm going to show you a flash mob that was done in Times Square, not Times Square, in Grand Central Station in New York. It's very, very interesting. So we'll watch that one later on. Okay. Thinking like a sociologist. So yesterday we had 2 questions on the board. Does anybody remember what they were? What were the 2 questions we asked yesterday? Yes, Leah.
How do people relate and influence each other?
Okay.
And what can you observe about society?
Okay. So those 2 things factor into thinking like a sociologist. So we define those as the 2 things we just looked at. So the first one was social interaction. How do people relate to each other? The second one was social phenomenon. What can you observe? How you interpret what you see and observe and how you interact falls under sociological perspective and sociological imagination. So perspective is how you view groups in a scientific, systematic way. Now, does that mean that I observe this table and judge them based upon my personal feelings? Is that sociological perspective? No. If I judge them in a scientific, systematic way, so I look at them and I am looking at their proximity, which is how close they're sitting to each other, their interaction. Are they looking at each other? How are they writing notes? Are they leaning over and whispering at each other? Is that an example of me using sociological perspective?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's something that's systematic. I have a reason. I have sort of a rubric of how I'm judging that group and how I'm looking at them. Did anybody yesterday at lunch pay closer attention to the way people were acting? Anybody look at things, notice anything, maybe the way people were behaving or doing? No? Okay. Anything yesterday at all where you observed a group and you noticed people doing something and it was like, oh, wait, I wonder why they do that? You ever done that? You ever had a situation where you're like, why is that group acting that way? Most of us have. So you begin to have a perspective And the reason why it's a perspective is that you usually choose some sort of system in which you evaluate what's going on. Are you looking at, am I looking at you guys and am I evaluating your behavior based upon your physical closeness, like how close you're sitting to each other? Am I evaluating you based upon your age? Am I evaluating you based upon gender or race? Am I evaluating you based upon your cultural background, by the color of shirts that you're wearing, like what kind of style of clothing? So I'm basically creating a rubric of how I am looking at a group and making assessments. Okay, sociological imagination is the ability to see the connection between the larger world and your personal life, and that's according to a sociologist we're going to look at in a minute called C. Wright Mills. So sociological imagination is taking a big picture and making it personal. So, can you give me an example of when you might look at something happening a long way away and say, how does that affect me? Yeah.
Like a disaster.
Right. So we've got that going on right now. How many of you live in Houston? Nobody. How many of you are trying to understand how people in Houston are dealing with Hurricane Harvey right now? That's sociological imagination. How many of you have began to feel perhaps empathy or sorrow or anxiety over people in those areas? Okay, so that's an example of you engaging in sociological imagination. You have some connection because we got rain from Hurricane Harvey, but we aren't experiencing anything like what they did, so we make a connection to understand them better. So, any questions or thoughts on that? Okay. Why would we do that? Why would it be important for us to try to see a connection between the bigger world and us? Why does that matter? Yeah.
So you can like put yourself in like their shoes and like think of how you would feel if that was happening to you. So you can like think of better ways to like help.
And that helps us to not only figure out better ways to help, but what does that do to us with those people? What does it help us? Well, empathy. You make a connection with them. Okay? It can happen to me. So there's a couple different ways it does. One is it makes you feel more connected to a group of people that you are not a part of. But two, it also helps you to analyze and honestly plan your behavior based upon the way other people do. You ever watch TV and seen a group of people doing something and you're like, I wouldn't do it that way? Is that an example of sociological imagination? Yeah, you're looking at it. How many of you do Black Friday shopping? Okay. How many of you have seen people do Black Friday shopping and are like, I'm not that crazy? Okay. You have engaged a little bit there in sociological imagination. You're seeing the way a group behaves and you're either going, I want to do that and I have a better way than all those idiots, or I have nothing to do with that because I'm going to be at home asleep on the day after Thanksgiving. Okay. So those are the ways that you approach and use sociological imagination. So you don't have to write this. This is just a quote. What I want you guys to do is take just a second and read this. I want you to use sociological perspective and sociological imagination to understand these crime statistics from the FBI and try to evaluate them. Okay, show of hands, how many of you still need a little bit more time? You don't get it. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. How do we use sociological perspective here? Crime statistics say 25 million Americans were victims of crime in 2006. One violent crime every 22 seconds, one property crime every 3, and one murder every 31 minutes. So what is the sociological perspective that we are using to analyze this data? The what?
The time.
Okay, the time is one perspective. So we're looking at how many in a year, every 22 seconds, every 3 seconds, and every 31 minutes. So that is one perspective. What's another one? What are we looking at? crimes. So we're looking at a criminal perspective. We're not looking at all Americans. We're only looking at Americans that have been affected by crime. Okay? My other question is this. Are we, when we have this perspective, are we trying to personalize what's going on here, or are we trying to use statistics? Right. So what would be a reason why we would engage in statistics looking at crime? What would we try to, why would we try to look at those numbers and not make it personal? Yeah, Brianna. Exactly. Because if you look at this last line, what does this last line indicate?
It's still going on.
It's still going on. Like it's not changing. No matter what we're doing, something's not working. So we've got a problem. Now, that is the perspective. That's sort of like, if you think of the perspective, it's like a frame. We're framing a picture. And when you take a picture, anybody ever, like on Instagram, you take a picture, maybe you crop it, you cut out like that person you don't want in the picture because they look kind of goofy. Yeah, so you do that, and that's basically what you're doing with sociological perspective, is you're framing it. What about imagination? So we're going to step back from the statistics now. How can we take sociological imagination and apply it to this? What could you do? Yeah?
See if you've been affected by crime.
Great. So here's how we can do imagination. Show of hands, how many of you have been the victim of a crime in the last year? I haven't, but I'm just like, nobody in the room. Yay, none of us are victims. Awesome. So then I don't have to ask the next question. Was there somebody in this room who was a victim of violent crime, property crime, and obviously if you're here, you weren't murdered. So what do we do to connect with this? How can we imagine a connection to this? Anybody in this room have a family member or a friend that was a victim of a crime in the last year? Okay, so suddenly we start seeing some hands go up. There's more of a connection that we're able to make. Think about it this way. And this is the way I look at it. Since we are using time as one of our perspectives, there is a violent crime every 22 seconds. So this class lasts 50 minutes. Anybody want to do some quick head math? How many violent crimes would occur in the course of this class? How many?
Like 150.
Okay. 150 violent crimes occur while you're sitting here talking about sociology. How does that impact you? What does that make you think about? Does that make you feel like crime is pretty common?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you're using that imagination, you're going, wow, the likelihood that this is going to affect me at some point is pretty good. Like that's, 150, there's 320 million people in the United States. There's still a lot of numbers, but 150 people in a 50-minute class period. So while you're at school today, that's basically what? Let's say 8 because Advocate's a little bit longer. So 8 times 150 is 800. About 1,000 violent crimes are committed while you're at school today. Okay, you're at school roughly 180 days. So what's 180 times 1,000? Is that what? 18 million? Something like that? 18 million violent crimes while you're at school this year. Okay, that's not even counting the night times while you're at school. So there's a lot of crime. There's a chance that's going to affect you. You make those connections. Here's another one that's really scary. Almost 1.5 people will be murdered while we're in class today. That's kind of scary. That's a lot of stuff. So you're making these connections and affecting the way that you are going to approach society and sociology. Okay? All right. So now we're going to talk about some pioneers. We're not going to be able to finish this because I think we get out of here at what time? 15? Okay, so we're going to spend about 5 minutes, and whatever we don't get done with today, we'll come back and pick up tomorrow. So in about 5 minutes, what we'll do is we'll break, and we'll start talking goals. We'll give you guys time to do that kind of stuff. Goals there, and then your coffee cup goals. So these people are in sociology, and primarily sociology is a European and American invention. It comes out of European philosophy, European scientists, and it moves forward. Some of these folks are old and have been dead for a long time. Some of them have been dead since I think before America was born. So, like a lot of them are, still a relatively new science, social science, in the grand scheme of things. It's not been around as long as, say, chemistry and physics and all those kind of things. But as a social science, both psychology and sociology are still relatively new in the grand scheme of things. The first one we want to look at is Auguste Comte. He was born in 1798, so he was born after America was born, so he's young. He was inspired by the French Revolution, and he was looking at these things that we see here, so social order and social change. Anybody want to tell me who's had world history or is interested in this? What happened in the French Revolution?
They killed basically a lot of the rich people, like almost like all of them.
Okay.
90%.
So the aristocrats, the high-level people, in fact, nobility, and some of the kings and queens. Who's the famous queen that was beheaded? Marie Antoinette. Okay, so the leadership, the lower people, the poor people, the people who don't have a lot of power in the French Revolution seize power. So he's looking at social order, which is basically the idea of social statics. So what that means is, if something is static, what does that mean it is?
It's stable.
Stable. Okay? So he is saying that social order is only established when you have things that are stable, that stay there for a long time. Up until the French Revolution, had the monarchy been the monarchy for a long time? If you were poor, was it easy for you to become not poor? No. So there was a lot of social static. There was social order in place before the revolution. When the revolution came, there were dynamics. So if something is dynamic, what does that mean?
Moving.
It's moving. Okay, there's a lot of change. So in the midst of the revolution, things happen. So what Comte would do is he would look at the idea of what was it that finally happened to make the lower classes rise up to overthrow the higher classes. So what do you think might be some factors that would lead to a social change? Yeah. Oppression. Finally, you have enough. You've had enough, you're tired of it. Yeah.
Famine.
Okay, famine. Why would famine suddenly drive people to react?
Desperation.
Okay. I don't have food, but the king and queen do. I'm going to go get it. And here's another factor. What are there usually more of? Poor people or rich people?
Poor people.
Okay. So is there power in numbers? Yeah. And so what ends up happening, Comte would look at that. He would look at the fact that, yes, there are more resources in the wealthy. They probably have, at that time, they probably have guards. They probably have people who are trained to protect them. They have weapons. But the poor people have numbers. And sometimes numbers can overwhelm power. And so he would look at that as a possible cause of social dynamics. He's considered the founder of sociology as a distinct subject, and he actually creates the term sociology. So this class exists because that guy right there made up a word. So any questions on Comte? Okay. Need more time or we're good? See a few people still writing. That's fine. That's fine. Aside from the French Revolution, what are some other examples that might be would have inspired people like Comte to look at society? What are some other situations where there was a change to the social order?
American Revolution.
Absolutely, yeah. Which is very, very similar to the French Revolution. Yeah.
Something like a disease outbreak into the Black Plague or something can probably influence people's lives.
Okay, so how could massive disease and pestilence change and affect the social order?
Because they're used to going like day-to-day life, not worrying about it. But once it's an outbreak and people start dying and everybody's worried about it, then they're gonna have to adjust to their life.
And the key phrase that you just said is everybody's worried about it. The Black Plague didn't just affect the poor people. It affected everybody. And so it acted as an equalizer. One of the things that can upset social order is when everybody suffers the same way. So again, would Hurricane Harvey be an example of how social order and social change could happen?
Yeah.
Yeah. Because it doesn't matter if you're rich or poor. If your house floods, you're kind of out of a house. Like, it doesn't really matter how nice your house is or how bad your house is. So it affects those things. Does it cause people to move? Yeah, people are migrated. We have people who are evacuees who have come here or even gone further north. Here's another thing, too. My family is living in the Waco area. How is Hurricane Harvey affecting people in Waco that's upsetting the social order? Does anybody have any idea? Yeah.
Mail.
Mail has been interrupted. So that's here. Mail is interrupted here. We don't get mail again until September 5th, I think. So yeah, good example. In Waco, what's happening is they're running out of gas. They're also running out of food. Was Waco directly impacted by Hurricane Harvey? I mean, it was a little bit. My mom had, I think, 2 inches of rain. My house, apparently, I found out yesterday, in our house, in our neighborhood, we had like 34 inches of rain. So there's a big difference in the amount of rain, but I have plenty of food and there's gas everywhere. But Waco is impacted because people were moving. People were leaving Houston and Corpus Christi, and they were hitting I-35, and they were driving through Waco and taking up all the gas and the food and moving on. So it affects them. There is a social change there. They're telling people to ration. Okay. Harriet Martineau, 1802 to 1876. She wrote Society in America in 1837, and she reviewed how well the U.S. upheld the promise of democracy. So I want you guys to think about the United States in 1837. Who had rights?
Anyone who had land.
People who had land. And who had land?
Wealthy men.
Right, white,
White,
rich
Wealthy
men.
white men. Okay, so do you think Harriet Martineau felt like democracy was pretty well upheld in the U.S.? No. So in 1837, you still have slavery, women have no rights, and if you're a wealthy white landowning man, you're good. You love democracy. It's all about you. So remember yesterday I asked you, do we have social structures that get set up that benefit the group in power and hurt those that are not? Yeah. So she's going to write about that. She took a very interesting viewpoint which said scholars should try to improve society, not just observe what's happening in society. How is that different from what other scholars might say?
Because a lot of sociologists, they just want to observe. They don't want to like step in because that would like impact their studying.
Do scientists want to get involved and affect the change in their organization? They're not supposed to. Scientists are supposed to stay out of things. That's why with psychology and sociology, you start to see, especially sociology, more than psychology really, sociology, you see activism. A lot of sociologists are activists for social change. Martineau is an example of that. She saw that democracy was not being upheld in the United States because some people were slaves, because women couldn't vote, own property, or basically make decisions on their own. And she didn't feel like that was a fair thing. So she acted to change things. How quickly did that work for her? Let me rephrase it this way. Did she see democracy accomplished? Not completely. What did she see in her lifetime? What changed? Slavery ended. Okay. What about women's right to vote? Not yet. She's got another almost 50 years before that comes to fruition for her. A little less than 50 years. So yeah. Okay. We're going to wrap up with that right there, and then we'll have you guys break up into your groups. So go ahead and